Welcome to Leaping Larry's Revolutionary Reading Theatre.
And as you know, we are going to be reading from Domenico Losurdo's History and Critique of a Black Legend. Now, what's interesting about where we are in this book, actually, A5U, welcome in, is that something we were talking about earlier with the borders actually kind of like relates to this. In the same way that the borders in the state aren't something we can just do away with at the whim of a small group of people. You know, it requires a mass collective energy and movement in order to actually accomplish the same way for many other things. And last time we were talking about that in regards to certain economic things, like doing away with commodity production, which you oftentimes see ultra leftists talking about. Now, this next part we're going to be getting to is called No Longer Differentiates Yours and Mine, The Vanishing of the Family. This is chapter 2, part 2. See if we get the whole second part of this chapter done now. Together with imperialism and capitalism, the October Revolution was called upon to put an end to the oppression of women. To make it possible for women to participate with equal rights in political and social life. It was necessary to free women, thanks to the widest possible development of social services, from domestic confinement, and from the division of labor that humiliated and stupefied them. The critique of traditional morality and its duplicity would then guarantee to women the sexual emancipation that until then had been reserved, albeit in a partial and distorted form, only to men. Following these grand transformations, would the institution of the family still make sense? Or was it destined to vanish? Alexandra Kollontai had no doubt. The family ceases to be necessary. In the meantime, it was being undermined by the complete freedom, spontaneity, and fluidity that characterized sexual relations. In addition to being cumbersome, the family proves to be superfluous. Quote, the bringing up of children is gradually taken over by society. Unquote. On the other hand, it was not the case that one must abandon oneself to regret. The family was the privileged place for the cultivation of selfishness, which went hand in hand with attachment to private property. In conclusion, quote, the socially conscious worker mother will rise to a point where she no longer differentiates yours and mine, and remembers that there are henceforth only our children, the children of communist workers, Russia, unquote. These ideas were harshly criticized by the Bolshevik leadership as a whole. In particular, when speaking in 1923, Trotsky wisely pointed out that such a vision ignored the responsibility of father and mother to their child, thus encouraging the abandonment of children and aggravating a scourge already widespread in Moscow in those years. And yet, in one form or another, such ideas remained widely popular in party circles. At the beginning of the 1930s, one of Stalin's close collaborators, Kagnovich, was still forced to confront them. In the words of his biographer, quote, while fully adhering to the principle of women's liberation, Kagnovich vehemently lashed out against extremist positions, which urged the liquidation of individual kitchens and advocated forced cohabitation in communes. And of course, this is the important part, right? The forced part. Sabsovic, one of the leftist planners, had even proposed to suppress any space of communal living between husband and wife other than a small bedroom for the night. He had advanced the idea of a large beehive building of 2,000 people with all facilities in common to stimulate the community spirit and suppress the institution of the bourgeois family. Unquote. But Kagnovich's and Stalin's attitude elicited harsh criticism from Trotsky, who had meanwhile become leader of the opposition. Quote, "The new cult of the family has not fallen out of the clouds. Privileges have only half their worth, if they cannot be transmitted to one's children. But the right of testament is separate from the right of property." And therefore, the recovery of the institution of the family, with the refusal of a common call to absorb and dissolve it, referred to the defense of the right of hereditary transmission and the right of property, and thus assumed a clear counter-revolutionary meaning. And in fact, by providential coincidence, Trotsky ironizes, the triumphant rehabilitation of the family takes place simultaneously with the return of the honoring of money. The resurrection of the family goes hand in hand with the increase of the educative role of the ruble. The consecration of the conjugal fidelity goes hand in hand with the consecration of private property. To put it in religious terms, along with the seventh, the fifth commandment is also fully restored to its rights, as yet, to be sure, without any references to God. In fact, upon closer inspection, this invocation is already looming on the horizon. In intervening on the draft of the Constitution of 1936, Stalin polemicized against those who would like to prohibit the celebration of religious ceremonies, and to have the ministers of religion be disenfranchised. And again, Trotsky intervened to denounce this unacceptable retreat from the initial projects of definitive liberation of society from the shackles of superstition. You starting to feel how annoying Trotsky is yet?
The storming of heaven is now brought to a stop. The bureaucracy, concerned about their reputation for respectability, have ordered their young godless to surrender their fighting armor and sit down their books. In relation to religion, there is gradually being established a regime of ironical neutrality. But that is only the first stage.
Along with the family and the right of inheritance and property, the Marxian opium of the people could not fail to return. This new chapter in the indictment of betrayal was also based on the dialectic we already know. By putting an end to the bourgeois family with its petty interests, inveterate prejudices, and dead rules, the revolution would have opened a space marked exclusively by love, freedom, and spontaneity. And yet, it is interesting to note that what provoked Trotsky's protest and indignation was already the idea of a legal regulation of family relations.
The genuine socialist family from which society will remove the daily vexation of unbearable and humiliating cares will have no need of any regimentation, and the very idea of laws about abortion and divorce will sound no better within its walls than the recollection of houses of prostitution or human sacrifices.
Fuck you, Trotsky. The condemnation of the politics of leaders, or the transformation of love, of power into love, is the next part. But you see how this last part is talking about the abolition of the family, which indeed is probably something that will result from a developing communist revolution, right? As the material conditions change and as resources become available to everyone, yes, it is natural to think that probably the family relations will indeed vastly change to a form which we probably can't even imagine right now. Hey Kay, welcome in, great to see you. However, just like what I was talking about at the beginning of the stream, it's not something that can be done by a small group of revolutionaries by force. As I explained, like with Kim Jong-un and DPRK and every socialist government that exists, every actual Marxist-Leninist party that is in a leading position never leads by force, by commands and decrees. That's a capitalist way of doing it. And that way only leads to you having to enforce everything by force and can never build unity. The working class has a weapon in the form of working class ideology, which, unlike bourgeois ideology, champions the interests of everybody. So, unlike them, we don't have to use force to get everybody on our side. We have that working class ideology on our side, which champions everybody's interests. Which is why we have to take the very circuitous route to get there. But that is what ultimately makes, socialism what will be such a longer lasting society, a more sustainable society. Because of that, right? However, again, just like with the borders, just like with the state, you can't just force it. The people have to be educated. So society is turned into a great big school, ideological education, policies against fascism and the return of capitalism. And while this is going on, people are being transformed into communist-minded people from living in their new conditions, undergoing new social education, and living in new social relations, right? And so you can't, force the end of borders before the masses are ready. The masses do that. The masses are the ones who abolish the borders. The masses are the ones who abolish the state. They wither away the state by abolishing classes, is more accurate. Just like the family. You can't forcibly abolish the family. Those relations are changed by the masses over time. Cuban citizens wanted a more progressive family unit despite the religions still in Cuba. People will advance themselves along with their material conditions met. Exactly. And that shows too, Chawir, how the two aren't completely combined, right? Because that shows that the religion can still remain, and those other progressive family values and stuff and pro-capitalism can still remain as well. Oh, yeah, I actually have this in my thing already, right here. Same brain cell, Laney. I do have this for some candy later. I am gonna save it because it's in a very particular autistically structured order. But it's funny that I've already got the exact same link as you. That's hilarious. Already in my list. Funny. So, yeah, I just want to explain that. And I mean, it's the same with leaders as well. The way that the masses interact with their leaders is not something that a small group of revolutionaries determine. And they should instead champion and hold higher that relation, that dialectical relation, which is what DPRK's position on the leader and the masses is. And people can like say, okay, well, that's weird or whatever in the way that that ends up working out in the way that people relate to it. But that's just because that you're not living through the experience of revolution and a life or death liberation struggle that's at that same degree. We're at a different stage of that struggle. So of course there's things about that a further stage of that struggle we don't yet understand. So that's what so the last chapter is like about that, but about the family. The family will change, but the masses will do it. Okay, so the next part is the condemnation of the politics of leaders, or the transformation of power into love. And so, far beyond the institution of the family, and the right of inheritance and property, and the religious consecration of power, of the head of the family and of the owner, Trotsky's polemic concerned of the problem of the juridical organization of society as a whole, the problem of the state. This is the central question towards which all the particular questions previously analyzed converge. When and in what manner does the process of extinction of the state envisioned by Marx begin after the overcoming of capitalism? The victorious proletariat, affirms Lenin's State and Revolution, on the eve of the Bolshevik October, quote, needs only a state which is withering away. And yet, by setting in motion a gigantic wave of nationalizations, the new power gives an unprecedented impulse for the extension of the state apparatus. And as he proceeds to build the new society, Lenin was forced, whether aware of it or not, to distance himself more and more from anarchism and from the positions he had originally taken. Although I think that he had always sort of polemicized against anarchism, but to realize this, just take a look at an important intervention, Better But Fewer, published in Pravda on March 4th, 2023. The novelty of the slogans immediately emerges. Quote, improve our state apparatus, to seriously strive to build up a state. The building of a really new state apparatus, one really worthy to be called socialist, Soviet. To improve administrative work, and to do all of this without hesitating to learn from the best models of Western Europe. Quote unquote. But doesn't massively extending the state apparatus and forcibly posing the problem of its improvement mean effectively renouncing the ideal of the extinction of the state? Of course, the realization of this ideal can be postponed to a very remote future. But in the meantime, how should public property, which has now undergone an enormous expansion, be managed? And what forms should power take in Soviet Russia as a whole? Even in State and Revolution, written at a time when the denunciation of representative regimes co-responsible for World War I massacre wars was at its most bitter, and could not fail to be, we can read that even the most developed democracy cannot do without representative institutions. And yet, the expectation of the extinction of the state continued to fuel mistrust of the idea of representation at the very moment in which the leaders of the Soviet Russia multiplied representative bodies, as the Soviets undoubtedly were. Not shying away from second or third degree representation, the lower level Soviets elect their delegates to the higher level Soviet. Controversy was not slow to flare up. The problem of re-establishing order and revitalizing the productive apparatus, with the related recognition of the principle of competence, also arose in the factories. Already at the beginning of the new regime, social and political circles, reluctant to change, denounced the coming of power of bourgeois specialists, or rather of a new bourgeoisie. And once again, they targeted Trotsky in particular, who at that time occupied a very prominent role in the direction of the state military apparatus as a leading military person. It is a controversy that also rebounds outside of Russia. Significant was the criticism by Gramsci, who celebrated the new state taking shape in the country of the October Revolution, and paid homage to the Bolsheviks as an aristocracy of statesmen, and to Lenin as the greatest statesman of contemporary Europe. They were able to put an end to the dark abyss of misery, barbarism, anarchy, and dissolution, opened up by a long and disastrous war. But, an anarchist objected, this apologia, full of lyricism, of the state, and of stateletry, of state socialism, authoritarian, legalitarian parliamentarism, is in contradiction with the Soviet Constitution itself, which is committed to establishing a regime in which there will be no more class divisions nor state power, quote unquote. It is not just from self-identified anarchist circles and authors who adopted a critical position. Some of those expressing dissatisfaction, disappointment, and sharp dissent were also exponents of the international communist movement. Let us give the word to one of them, namely Pannekoek, who can no longer recognize himself in the political action of the Bolsheviks. The technical and administrative cadres in the factories and in the state apparatus exercise greater authority than is commensurable with developed communism. Thus, a new bureaucracy inevitably arose from the new leaders and functionaries. Bureaucracy, emphasized the platform of workers' opposition in Russia, is a direct negation of mass self-activity. Unfortunately, it is a scourge that pervades the very marrow of our party, as well as of the Soviet institutions. And you wonder why all the old Bolsheviks had to be purged. I'm just kidding. Unless, beyond Russia, these criticisms also, and primarily, were directed at the West. They called for an end to the bourgeois system of representation, to parliamentarism. More than the Bolshevik dictatorship, it was the principle of representation that was condemned. Yes, some third person decides your fate. This is the whole essence of bureaucracy. Unquote. The degeneration of Soviet Russia already lay in the fact that it was a single person who assumed a given office, in the factories as at every level. Collective management is being replaced by one-man management, which is a product of the individualist conception of the bourgeois class, and which expresses, quote, in principle, the unrestricted, isolated, free will of one man, disconnected from the collective. Mass plan? Nah, this guy runs it all. Jesus Christ. Rather than mass politics, mass in politique, the Third International now conducts politics of leaders, Führer politique. Jesus fucking Christ. What? Who's saying that? Gortier. Some Italian anarchist. As we can see, what made people cry betrayal of the original ideals, even more than the abuse of power, was the recourse to the usual organs of power, all based on the distinction, quote, / opposition between rulers and ruled, between leaders and masses, between managers and managed, and therefore all based on the exclusion of direct action of the mass politics. If the Soviets were not spared from mistrust, contempt was explicitly reserved for parliament, trade unions, parties, including, on occasion, the Communist Party, itself affected by principle of representation, and therefore by the scourge of bureaucracy. Starting to see a problem here? In the final analysis, on closer inspection, even more than the organs of power, it was power as such that was being targeted. Quote, "It is the curse of the labor movement. As soon as it has achieved a certain power, it seeks to increase that power by unprincipled means." Unquote. Yeah, okay. In this way, it ceased to be pure. This was the case with German social democracy, and this was also happening with the Third International. And don't even get me started with the Fourth International, for God's sakes. In this context can be placed the Young Bloc, who, from the Revolution and the Soviets, in addition to overcoming the economy and the mercantile spirit and money itself, also expected the transformation of power into love. If the German philosopher, by moving these passages and these overly emphatic expectations from the second edition of The Spirit of Utopia, distanced himself from the more clearly messianic aspects of his thought, there was no shortage in Soviet Russia and beyond of communists who cried scandal in the final analysis because of the failure to bring about the miracle of the transformation of power into love, quote unquote. I mean, everyone was provided for, you know? The revolution that feeds the children type situation. I'll have to add that soundbite. In the very first years of the life of Soviet Russia, the anti-bureaucratic polemics primarily labeled Lenin and Trotsky, more than Stalin, among the most eminent defenders and knights of bureaucracy. The picture changed significantly in the following years. Even before considering its contents, the passage of the 1936 Constitution represented a turning point, already in that it broke with anarchist representation, which were tenaciously attached to the ideal of withering away of the state, and according to which law of the opium of the people and the idea of the Constitution as a bourgeois idea. In Stalin's words, the 1936 Constitution does not confine itself to stating the formal rights of citizens, but stresses the guarantee of these rights, by the means by which these rights can be exercised. In other words, a socialist constitution is not a capitalist constitution. While also insufficient, and not even the essential aspect, the formal guarantee of rights did not seem to be irrelevant here. Stalin emphasized with favor the fact that the new constitution had ensured the introduction of universal, direct, and equal suffrage with secret ballot. But it was precisely on this point that Trotsky intervened critically. In bourgeois society, the secret ballot serves, quote, to defend the exploited
from the terror of the exploiters.
The reappearance of this institution of Soviet society was proof that even in the USSR, the people must defend themselves from the intimidation, if not an actual exploiting class, at any rate, of the bureaucracy. To those who demanded that the problem of the extinction of the state be confronted, Stalin responded in 1938 by urging not to turn the lesson of Marx and Engels into dogma and empty scholasticism. The delay in the realization of the ideal was explained by permanent capitalist encirclement. And yet, in enumerating the functions of the socialist state, in addition to the traditional functions of defense against the class enemy at domestic and international levels, Stalin drew attention to a third function. This was the work of economic organization and cultural education performed by our state bodies, with the purpose of developing the infant shoots of the new socialist economic system and re-educating the people in the spirit of socialism." Unquote. AKA what Kim Jong-il later would describe as, and Kim Il-sung would later describe as, establishing Juche. But you see, because a bunch of Trotskyists ended up wrestling their way to the leadership of the USSR, that all fell apart for an economic reductionist nonsensical point like what Trotsky had. And just basically ignoring that ideological education, which led to it being completely undermined and the people being unaware of how to get rid of the renegades in their party, right? Which at the same time served those reactionaries. It served the counter-revolutionaries. It served Khrushchev and the Trotskyist clique that took over the USSR. It served them because if the masses didn't know the means within the party to remove them and the other counter-revolutionary elements, then they wouldn't been able to carry on with their counter-revolutionary activity, right? And I think that was the whole point at the end of the day. Whether they were an official fifth column or just thought that they knew better how to do revolution, it's hard to say. We'd have to look at more of the evidence of that. Trotsky seems like there might be some evidence for fifth element or fifth column type situation with Trotsky himself. Khrushchev and others, I don't know, but they sure fucking worked awful hard to undo everything, didn't they? Did they want to cast aside Mao and be rich? Yeah, I mean that is what Khrushchev did essentially. That basically fucking China didn't, you know. And that's what they did. I mean, they embraced Trotskyism and it drove the thing off a cliff. Which, by the way, I did do a video on my YouTube if you want to check it out. My reading of Fundamentals of Revolutionary Party Building by Kim Jong-il talks about that. Alright, I'll continue. It was a point on which the report of the 18th Congress of the CPSU insisted strongly. Now, the main task of our state, inside the country, is the work of peaceful economic organization and cultural education. The theorization of this third function was in itself an essential novelty. But Stalin went further, declaring that, in place of this function of suppression, the state acquired the function of protecting socialist property from thieves and pilferers of the people's property. Unquote. Admittedly, this was a somewhat problematic, indeed mystifying statement. It certainly did not fairly reflect the situation in the USSR in 1938, where terror raged and the Gulag expanded monstrously. But here we are dealing with another aspect. Is the thesis of the extinction of the state valid, and to what extent? Will our state remain in the period of communism also? Yes, it will. Unless the capitalist encirclement is liquidated, and unless the danger of foreign military attack has disappeared. So, the realization of communism in the Soviet Union, or in a group of countries, would have meant the final demise of the first function of the socialist state, the safeguard against the danger of counter-revolution internally. Not the second, protection against the external threat, which, in the presence of powerful capitalist countries, would continue to be vital, even, quote, in the period of communism. Excuse me. But why should the collapse of the capitalist encirclement and the fading of the second function have been followed by the fading of the third function as well, namely the work of economic organization and cultural education, as well as the protecting socialist property from thieves and pilferers of the people's property. There is no doubt that Stalin revealed uncertainties and contradictions, probably stimulated also by the political necessity of moving cautiously on a minefield, where every small divergence from the classical theses of the extinction of the state exposed him to the charge of treason. I like the word liquidate too. The Kirov assassination, power plot or terrorism? So what do you think, chat? Once before I start reading this, I just want to see in chat. What do you think? Do you think it's right that the socialist state, once the working class takes power, once they build a state on the ruins of the old capitalist status quo that existed before, do you think it is right that they then protect that state public property from theft? The Kirov assassination, power plot or terrorism? The ruling group that assumed power in October 1917 appeared from the outset deeply divided on the most important issues of domestic and international politics. Barely contained while Lenin was still alive, this rift became irremediable once the charismatic leader was gone. Did the clash remain confined to politico-ideological sphere? In the case of Sergei M. Kirov, a top leader of the CPSU, who was killed on December 3rd, 1934, in Leningrad, in the front of the door of his office by gunshots fired from a young communist, Leonid Nikolaev. Long gone are the times when it could be uncontestably claimed that, quote, that Stalin plotted the murder through his police agents is no longer seriously in doubt, unquote. The version and the insinuations contained in the secret speech had raised strong doubts as early as the mid-1990s. But now, we have at our disposal the research of a Russian scholar who published in French in a series directed by Stéphane Courtier and Nicolas Reth, i.e. the editors of the Black Book of Communism. We are therefore in the presence of a work that presents itself with more solid anti-Stalinist credentials than ever before. And yet, while denying that there was a vast conspiracy behind the assassination, it tears to pieces the version contained, or suggested, in the secret speech of the 20th Congress of the CPSU. Whoops. Khrushchev's account turns out to be somewhat inaccurate in a number of details. On the other hand, its author knew that he needed weighty arguments to provoke a psychological shock in the followers of the Little Father of the Peoples. Well, the theses of Stalin's conspiracy against Kirov admittedly met this need. The real relationships of cooperation and friendship between the leader and his collaborator, on the other hand, was clearly shown from the portrait that the Russian historian drew of Kirov. Quote, this open-minded man loved neither intrigue nor lies, nor deception. Stalin had to appreciate these character traits that were the basis of their relationship. According to the testimonies of his contemporaries, Kirov was indeed able to make objections to Stalin, to dampen his suspicious spirit and roughness. Stalin genuinely was enthused by him, and he had confidence in him. Passionate about fishing and hunting, he often sent fresh fish and game to Moscow. Stalin had such confidence in Kirov that he invited him several times to the sauna, an honor only General Vlasic, head of his personal security, shared. Unquote. Until the end, nothing intervened to disturb this relationship. As confirmed by the research of another Russian historian, nothing emerges from the archive that points in the direction of a political divergence or rivalry between the two. The conspiracy thesis is all the more ridiculous given the fact that Kirov had a minimal role in the highest bodies of the party, in the Politburo, and concentrated its said on the administration of Leningrad. But if the idea of a rivalry pitting Kirov against Stalin rests on nothing, Trotsky's reaction, on the other hand, gives food for thought.
To turn the right in foreign domestic policies could not fail to arouse alarm among the more class-conscious element of the proletariat. To this must be added a dull rumbling among the youth, particularly among that section that, being close to the bureaucracy, observes its arbitrariness, its privileges, and its abuses. In this thick atmosphere, the shot of Nikolaev exploded. Very likely, he wished to protest against the party regime, the uncontrollability of the bureaucracy, or the course to the right.
The evident sympathy or understanding for the bomber and the contempt and hatred reserved for Kirov are explicit. Far from mourning the latter as a victim of the Kremlin dictator, Trotsky brands him as clever and unscrupulous Leningrad dictator, a typical representative of his corporation. And again, in crescendo, the assassination of Kirov, a rude satrap, does not call forth any sympathy. Huh. Weird, right? It is an individual against whom the revolutionaries' wrath has been brooding for some time, and who has been struck down.
As for the latest outburst of terrorism, it does not rest either upon the old ruling classes or upon the kulaks. The terrorists of the latest draft are recruited exclusively from among the young, from the ranks of the communist youth and the party.
At least at this time, between 1935 and 1936, there is no mention whatsoever of the Kirov assassination attempt as staged. Yes, it is stated that the whole thing can be instrumentalized by the bureaucracy as a whole, but at the same time it is stressed, not without complacency, that every single bureaucrat trembles before the terror coming from below. If they also lack the experience of class struggle and revolution, these young people are inclined to go underground and learn to struggle and temper their character for the future, constitute a reason for hope. To the Soviet youth, who were already beginning to sow fear among the members of their ruling caste, Trotsky explicitly appealed for the new revolution that in his eyes imposed itself. The bureaucratic regime had unleashed, quote, the struggle against the youth, as he had already denounced in the title of one of his central works, The Revolution Betrayed. Now, the oppressed will overthrow the oppressors.
Every revolutionary party finds its chief support among the younger generation of the rising class. Political decay expresses itself in the loss of ability to attract the youth under one's banner. The Mensheviks relied upon a more respectable, skilled upper stratum of working class, always prided themselves on it, and looked down upon the Bolsheviks.
Of which Trotsky was a Menshevik, by the way, the entire fucking time. Until he switched sides at the last second when he knew the Bolsheviks were gonna win. Anyway,
subsequent events harshly showed them their mistake. At the decisive moment, the youth carried with them the more mature stratum and even the old folks.
again, rich coming from somebody who was a Menshevik right up until the last minute. It is a dialectic destined to repeat itself. However, immature, the forms it may initially take, the revolt against oppression still has a positive value. After reiterating his contempt and hatred for Kirov, Trotsky adds,
Our relation to the assassin remains neutral, only because we know not what motivates or guides him. If it became known that Nikolaev acted as a conscious avenger for workers' rights trampled upon by Kirov, our sympathies would be fully on the side of the assassin.
like Irish terrorists, or those from other countries, Russian terrorists too deserve respect. Initially, the authorities' investigations turn in the direction of the White Guards. In fact, in Paris, these circles were well organized. They had managed to carry out a number of attacks on Soviet territory. In Belgrade, similar circles were operating. The monthly magazine they published specified in the November 1934 issue that in order to overthrow the leaders of the country of the Soviets, it was convenient to use the weapons of the terrorist attack. Among those leaders to be eliminated was precisely Kirov. And yet, these investigations did not lead to results. The Soviet authorities then began to look in the direction of the leftist opposition. As we have seen, corroborating the new lead is Trotsky, who not only emphasizes the revolutionary ebullience of the Soviet youth, but also makes it clear that those resorting to violence are not and cannot be classes that are definitively defeated, and therefore now renounced. The history of the individual terror in the Soviet Union clearly marks the stages in the general evolution of the country. At the dawn of Soviet power, in the atmosphere of the still unfinished Civil War, terrorist deeds were perpetrated by White Guards, or social revolutionaries. When the former ruling classes lost hope of a restoration, terrorism also disappeared. The Kulak terror, echoes of which have been observed up into very recent times, had always a local character and supplemented the guerrilla warfare against the Soviet regime. As for the latest outburst of terrorism, it does not rest either upon the old ruling classes or upon the Kulak. The terrorists of the latest draft are recruited exclusively from among the young, from the ranks of the communist youth and the party. Not infrequently from the offspring of the ruling stratum. If the old classes wiped out first by the October Revolution, and then by the collectivization of agriculture, had resigned themselves, this was certainly not true for the proletariat. Protagonist of the revolution and momentarily blocked by and oppressed by Stalinist bureaucracy, it is a ladder that must tremble. The attack on Kirov and the spread of terrorism among Soviet youth are a symptom of the isolation and hostility that surround and pressure the usurpers of Soviet power. True, Trotsky is quick to point out that the individual terrorism is not really effective. But this is a clarification that is not entirely convincing, and perhaps not even Trotsky himself was convinced. Meanwhile, in the conditions in which the USSR finds itself, it is an inevitable phenomenon. Terrorism is the tragic completion of bureaucratism. What is more, while it may not be able to solve the problem, individual terror has nevertheless an extremely important symptomatic significance. It characterizes the sharp contradiction between the bureaucracy and the broad masses of people, especially the young. In any case, it built towards critical mass for the explosion, i.e., for the political disturbance designed to inflict on the regime of Stalin, a fate analogous to that suffered by the regime headed by Nicholas II. Okay, terrorism, coup d'etat, and civil war. The overthrow of the Romanov dynasty had been preceded by a long series of attacks, promoted by organizations that, despite the hard blows of repression, had always managed to reconstitute themselves. In Trotsky's eyes, a similar process was developing in the USSR in response to the betrayal consummated by the bureaucracy. On closer inspection, what threatened it were not really individual acts of terrorism, but the symptoms of a new great revolution. All indications agree that the further course of development must inevitably lead to a clash between the culturally developed forces of the people and the bureaucratic oligarchy. There is no peaceful outcome for this crisis. The development leads obviously to the road of revolution. Unquote. A decisive civil war loomed on the horizon. And under conditions of civil war, the assassination of individual oppressors ceases to be an act of individual terror. In any case, the Fourth International leads against Stalinism a life and death struggle, quote unquote, which would put an end to a clique already condemned by history. As can be seen, the attack on Kirov evoked a specter of civil war within the forces that had overthrown the ancient regime. What's going on? I feel like you're all having an all right conversation, are you not? What's going on? People attending theory secure the state. Theory explains the duties of the state to people. The people maintain the state, and therefore the state is devoted to care for the people. Oh, disagreeing about my question? Oh, yeah. That's fine. I mean, that's the reason. That is the reason why I asked that question. Like you said a bad word. What? What? I can't. Yeah. Oh yeah, I said it. Is it okay? Is it legit if the socialist state? Do you think it's a legitimate use of the socialist state to enforce the or to fight against the theft of public property? Alright, if you all are good though, I'm gonna continue reading. Let me know if you need me. It seems like a good discussion. I guess. I mean, I'm of the firm position that it is legitimate for the socialist state to reinforce socialist property laws. That's what the socialist property. I mean, socialist property that's working class. That's not capitalist laws. Those are working class laws. They're based on working class property of public property, cooperative property, and what we call, to differentiate it where we are today, personal property. Or what socialist states oftentimes just term private property. Because it's actual private property. You know? As can be seen, the attack on Kirov evoked the specter of civil war within the forces that had overthrown the ancient regime. In fact, this specter had accompanied the history of Soviet Russia like a shadow since the moment of its establishment. In order to foil the peace of Brest-Litovsk, which he experienced as capitulation to German imperialism and a betrayal of proletarian internationalism, Bakunin briefly cultivated the idea of a kind of coup d'etat aimed at removing from power, at least for a time, the one who, until then, was the undisputed leader of the Bolsheviks. If it is already hovering while Lenin is still alive, despite the enormous prestige surrounding his figure, the specter of the tearing apart of Bolshevik leadership group and of civil war within the revolutionary camp itself takes definite shape in the following years. This is what is unequivocally apparent from the important testimonies from within the anti-Stalinist opposition, and from turncoats of the communist movement, in whom the old faith had turned into implacable hatred. Let us see how Boris Suverin describes the situation that arose in the CPSU about 10 years after the October Revolution. Quote, "The opposition, on its side, completed its organization as a clandestine party within the only party, with its own hierarchy in miniature, its Politburo, its Central Committee, its regional and local agents, its foundational groups, its subscriptions, its circulars, its code for letters." Unquote. That's Sovereign. In perspective, was one of not only political, but also military confrontation. In her memoir published in the United States soon after the end of World War II, Ruth Fisher, already a leading figure in German communism, and a member of the Comintern Presidium from 1922 to 1924, told of how she had, at one time, participated in the organization of the USSR, of the resistance against the totalitarian regime established in Moscow. This was 1926. Having broken with Stalin the year before, Zinoviev and Kamenev had reconnected with Trotsky. The bloc had organized for the seizure of power. Thus, a widespread clandestine network had developed, extending as far as Vladivostok and the Far East. Couriers spread confidential party and state documents, or transmitted encrypted messages. Armed bodyguards provided surveillance for secret meetings. The bloc leaders began to plan the final steps, based on the assumption that the confrontation with Stalin could be solved only by violence. They met in a forest in the vicinity of Moscow in order to thoroughly analyze the military aspect of their program, beginning with the role of those army units willing to support the coup d'etat. Fisher thus continues, quote, "This was an affair largely of technicalities, to be arranged between the two military leaders, Trotsky and Lashvich, Deputy Commissioner of War, who would die not long after, prior to the purges. Since, as second in command of the Red Army, Lashvech was still in a better legal position. He was charged with laying the groundwork for military action against Stalin. Unquote. In this context, should be placed the street demonstrations organized the following year for the 10th anniversary of the October Revolution from Moscow and Leningrad. They were to spread to other industrial centers, and thus the party hierarchy would be forced to yield. In those recent years, oh, see ya is all one word. See? It's like this. Here, I'll do it for you. In those years, the bitterness of political confrontation taking place in Soviet Russia was a mystery to no one in Europe. The history of that struggle between Stalin and Trotsky is the story of Trotsky's attempt to capture the state. It is the story of an unsuccessful coup d'etat. The brilliant organizer of the Red Army, still surrounded by tremendous popularity, certainly did not resign himself to defeat. His overweening and cynical pride turned him into a kind of Red Bonaparte, backed by the army, the working masses, and the young communist spirit of revolution against Lenin's old guard and against the hierarchy of the party. Yes, the tide of sedition rose around the Kremlin. Tracing this picture was a book, Coup d'etat, The Technique of Revolution, which saw the light of day in Paris in 1931 and immediately enjoyed considerable success. The author, Cosio Malaparte, who had been to Moscow and had conversations with leading personalities, gives the reading of 1927 Coup d'etat that we have seen confirmed by Ruth Fisher, that is, an authoritative representation of the anti-Stalin opposition. The arrest of Trotsky on the eve of the 10th birthday of the October Revolution would produce an unfavorable impression. Trotsky could hardly have chosen a more suitable moment for his attempt on the state. His tactical wisdom had shown him how to cover his position. Stalin would never dare to arrest him for fear of tyrannical appearances. If and when he should dare to do so, it would surely be too late, said Trotsky. By then, the bonfires of the 10th anniversary of the revolution would have burnt out, and Stalin would no longer stand at the helm of the state. How cute. As is well known, these plans failed, and Trotsky, expelled from the party, was forced to move first to Alma-Ata and then to Turkey. Here, the Soviet consular authorities paid him, by way of royalties, $1,500. It may have been a ridiculous sum, as a historian who was a follower and biographer of Trotsky puts it, but the gesture can be read as an attempt not to further sharpen the contradiction. Just want to see something here. That's right. Holy shit, this chapter. Okay. This is a long chapter. We're going to do one more part of this. This was a much longer chapter than I expected. We're going to do this one more part here. And then that will be over an hour. So I want to keep the YouTube videos to around an hour, I think. So we'll do this last part. That'll bring us just over an hour. I think that's still acceptable. Conspiracy, infiltration of the state apparatus, and Aesopian language. The revolutionary in exile did not give up his plans. In what way did he try to realize them? Malaparte writes, the sabotage on the railways, in electric power stations, and in post and telegraph offices increased from day to day. Trotsky's agents had gained an entry everywhere. They tested every spoke in the wheel of the state's public services, and from time to time they prevented it from spinning altogether. These were mere skirmishes leading up to the insurrection itself. Yeah, real good work there, Trotskyists. Is this just fantasy or the echo of regime propaganda? The book quoted here circulated widely in Europe at the time. Oh, wait, sorry. Yeah, wait. Is this just fantasy or the echo of regime propaganda? The book quoted here circulated widely in Europe at the time, and the theses put forward in it did not seem to raise ironic smiles or cries of scandal. I want to see this footnote. As with terrorism, so with sabotage, one must not lose sight of Russia's peculiar history. In 1908, both the oil industrialists and Stalin had repeatedly condemned, with obviously different motives, the tendency of certain sections of the working class to promote their claims by resorting to economic terrorism. While pointing out that the ultimate cause of this phenomenon was capitalist exploitation, the Bolshevik leader had hailed the resolution recently adopted by the strikers at Mezhev's factory against incendiarism and economic assassination, against the anarchic, old terrorist rebel tendencies. Unquote. At the beginning of the 1930s, had this tradition completely vanished, or did it continue to manifest itself in new forms? In any case, we have seen the White Guards treasure it, and the left opposition? At least the plans for insurrection, mentioned by Malaparte, find an important confirmation. Trotsky's biographer thus refers to the attitude his hero continued to adopt from exile. Quote, the advice is simple. The opposition must acquire a solid military education, with seriousness and conscious activity in the party, and once they have been expelled, in the proletarian and Soviet organizations in general. Always referring back to the International. Unquote. Here, the conspiratorial tradition, which had greatly contributed to its rise, is turned against Soviet power. In what is to be done, Lenin had emphatically stressed, we revolutionaries must without fail devote the most serious attention to propaganda and agitation among soldiers and officers, and to the creation of military organizations affiliated to our party. AKA, you gotta have that revolutionary education extending to the military as well. Taking this lesson to heart, the opposition was organizing a clandestine network that paid special attention to the military at large. Its troubled process of formation made the work of infiltration easier. Emblematic was what happened at the time of the establishment of the Cheka, the first political police force in Soviet Russia. On the 6th of July 1918, an assassination attempt cost the life of the German ambassador to Moscow. The culprit was Yakov G. Blumkin, a socialist revolutionary who intended to protest against the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and called it into question. When Felix D. Javernsky, head of the Cheka, went to the German embassy in Moscow to apologize on behalf of the Soviet government, he was informed that the attackers had presented themselves with Cheka credentials. In order to ascertain the truth, he went to the headquarters of this institution, where he was arrested by dissident Chekists, themselves adherents or close to the Socialist Revolutionary Party. Later, freed by the Red Guards, Dzerzhinsky then proceeded to purge the political force and execute those responsible for the conspiracy and mutiny. In conclusion, the victims of the first purge are the Chekists, albeit those in the opposition. The protagonist of the assassination attempt had managed to escape, but he had not disappeared from the scene. Trotsky acknowledged publicly in the end of 1929 that he had been visited by Blumkin, still an agent of the Red Army Intelligence Service. Lev Sedev, Trotsky's son and collaborator, tried to make it appear that this would have been something coincidental. In fact, a document preserved at Stanford shows that Trotsky's contacts with Blumkin did not arise from a chance meeting, but from an organized link with the USSR. In this, the secret agent evidently had an important role. It would be this connection that would prompt Stalin to have Blumkin shot, quote unquote. As can be seen, agents of the opposition had gained an entry everywhere. Even in the GPU lurks for some time a small nucleus of Trotsky loyalists. According to a contemporary US historian, perhaps Greenwich G. Yagoda himself, who directed the first phase of the Great Terror, would have played a double game before he too was swept away by it. Testimony from anti-Stalinist militants reveals that some of the leaflets to the opposition were printed in the GPU plant itself. It can be seen that there was continued tension in the Soviet Russia state terror machine, quote unquote. The infiltration was made easier by the timid openings of the regime. In calling for the fight against bureaucratic dictatorship, Trotsky pointed out that the new constitution creates at the same time a semi-legal cover for the struggle against it. It was fought even better by disguising itself, by concealing the intention to undermine and overthrow power. This is a point on which the leader of the opposition left no doubt. The work of undermining requires certain conspiratorial precautions. It is necessary to observe the precepts of conspiracy in the struggle. And again, quote, the life and death struggle is unthinkable without military craftiness. In other words, without lying and deceit. May the German proletariat then not deceive Hitler's police? Or perhaps Soviet Bolsheviks have an immoral attitude when they deceive the GPU, unquote. Again, the Bolshevik conspiratorial tradition backfired against the regime that emerged from the Bolshevik Revolution. In 1920, Lenin had called the attention of the revolutionaries to the viewpoint that it was obligatory to combine legal and illegal forms of struggle, and that it was obligatory to participate even in the most reactionary parliament and in a number of other institutions hemmed in by reactionary laws, unquote. That was not all. Revolutionaries must know how to make any sacrifice, and even, if need be, to resort to various stratagems, artifices, and illegal methods, to evasions, to subterfuges, as long as we get into the trade unions, remain in them, and carry on communist work within them at all costs. Unquote. This is precisely how the opposition behaved towards the institutions and political and social organizations of the hated Thermidorian regime. The conspirators adhered to a precise rule of conduct. Quote, they make their self-criticisms, recognize their mistakes, and are for the most part transferred. Those whom the Stalinist press now calls the double-faced men, or even the left-right faction, seek from that moment contacts which would enable them to broaden the front of resistance to Stalin's policy. On this road, they meet other groups. Unquote. One understands, then, the observation with two facers. The obsession that Khrushchev blamed on Stalin. In the meantime, the abandonment of the NEP came as the breaking with Bakurin. Regarding the latter's attitude, it may be interesting to read the testimony of Humbert Droz, a Comintern leader who was expelled from the Swiss Communist Party in 1942 for his disagreements with Stalin. Leaving for the first conference of the Revolutionary Trade Unions of Latin America in the spring of 1929, he went to greet Bakurin and had a conversation with him, which he reported as follows. He brought me up to date with the contacts made by his group with the Zionov-Kamenev faction in order to coordinate the struggle against the power of Stalin. A struggle which also envisioned the use of individual terror, with the main objective to rid themselves of Stalin, and to be clear, to make Stalin disappear. 3 years later, it was another exponent of the right, namely Martman and Rutin, who drew up and circulated a document which passed from hand to hand and which branded Stalin as an agent provocateur, who had to be got rid of, resorting even to tyrannicide. When Bakurin set out his plans, Humbert Droz objected to him that the introduction of individual terror into the political struggles born for the Russian Revolution would strongly risk turning those against who employed it. But Bakurin was unimpressed. On the other hand, even so severe an objection couldn't appeal to a man who by now, as Bakurin confidently revealed in 1936, harbored a deep hatred towards Stalin. Indeed, hatred so absolute as the sort to be reserved for a devil. While thus expressing himself in private, Bakurin edited the Soviet government organ Izvestia. Was this a glaring inconsistency? Not so from the point of view of the Bolshevik leader, who continued to combine legal and illegal work in order to overthrow a regime he now hated, and who seemed to treasure another recommendation from Lenin with reference to Tsarist Russia in what is to be done. We can read, quote, in contrary, ruled by an autocracy with a completely enslaved press, in a period of desperate political reaction, in which even the tiniest outgrowth of political discontent and protest is persecuted, the theory of revolutionary Marxism suddenly forces its way into the censored literature, and, though expounded in Aesopian language, is understood by all the interested. It is precisely how Bakurin used the platform of the Soviet government. His condemnation of the omnipotent, total state based on blind discipline, on judicial obedience, on the glorification of the leader, feigned to refer only to Hitler's Germany, but actually targets the USSR as well. The Aesopian language recommended by Lenin became immediately transparent when the denunciation encompassed cruel, uncultured provincialism. This was clearly the portrait which the opposition drew of Stalin. We have seen Trotsky speak of him as a minor provincial man. And in confidential conversations, it was Bakunin himself who expressed his disdain for a leader who had succeeded Lenin, while completely ignorant of foreign languages. Dwelling on the efficacy deployed in Tsarist Russia by the revolutionary message expounded in Aesopian language, what is to be done, thus continued. Quote, quite a considerable time elapsed before the government realized what had happened, and the unwieldy army of censors and gendarmes discovered the new enemy and flung itself upon him. Meanwhile, Marxist books were published one after another. Marxist journals and newspapers were founded. Nearly everyone became a Marxist. Marxists were flattered. Marxists were courted. And the book publishers rejoiced at the extraordinary, ready sale of Marxist literature. Bakunin and the opposition hoped that a similar phenomenon would create favorable climate for the overthrow of Stalin. But the latter had also read What is to be Done, and knew well the Bolshevik rules of conspiracy. In conclusion, we witnessed a prolonged civil war. The clandestine network reorganized itself, or tried to reorganize itself, despite the successive waves of repression, which became more and more merciless. In the words of an active militant in the struggle against Stalin, quote, though the opposition was shattered, annihilated, opposition continued, grew, in the army, in the administration, in the party, in the cities, and in the countryside. Each wave of terror by the Stalinist regime brought its echo of resistance, unquote. The Bolshevik leadership now appeared to be torn by a no-holds-barred trial of strength, which, at least in the expectations and hopes of Stalin's enemies, could at any moment openly and comprehensively involve the entire country. While the opposition could recall the lesson of Lenin and the conspiratorial tradition of Bolshevism to weave its plots in the shadows, this duplicity aroused the indignation of the Soviet power, which branded in false friends the most elusive and most insidious enemy. The tragedy ran towards its epilogue. There you go. That's our part for today.